possibility. Probably have to fly his family out for that to happen. Okay, I'll do it. Cool. Awesome. How'd you guys like the Sphere View Bible presentation last night? So good, right? You guys stoked about that? Yeah. I am. I was talking to John. I didn't fully get when they were like standing up with the. I was a little confused, so I think I need a little bit of help understanding that. So if anyone understood that, please help Aaron and I out. Because I would see like the media and communication people like stand up for like a second, and I was like, do they not know if they're supposed to go or what's going on? But then John was telling me when they would say the word like cry out, apparently that's communication or something like that. So it was like cry, and then they would like sit back down. But I was so confused. I was like, anyway. Cool. Well, thank you guys for going. Just a reminder that those are mandatory, and if you didn't go to those, you do lose participation points for that. All right. Cool. Well, I think I prayed for Sean yesterday because we were in a bit of a hurry. So today I want to go back to the baton passing. So I don't remember where Matthew, you were the last one. Jeremiah. Yeah. Come on up. Yes.
Come on, prophet. Lord, I pray that you bless today and that you bless Sean as he talks, and I pray that we as a DBS would strive to be a Joshua generation, that we would put away our comfort sins and be zealous about holiness, because that's what you want. And so I just pray that we listen, and we take to heart what you say, and we get convicted, which leads to transformation and transformed lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so when we finished yesterday, we finished by asking that question. And the question was, in light of the depravity of mankind, in light of the depravity of the time period of the judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and now in light of our present day society and the things that are happening, not just obviously in the Western countries, but in countries like Cambodia, what can we really hope to achieve? Are we just kind of kidding ourselves, in other words? Like we get together as YWAM and we have meetings and we talk about stuff and rah-rah and have worship and we just, beat the drums, literally beat the drums, and we dance around and, we sing songs like I'm going to be a history, changer in this world, and then we just kind of go back and do whatever. Like we're really fooling ourselves that we could turn the tide within the church or outside the church. And hopefully after we finished yesterday and we looked at some of the examples in Cambodia, we understand that it is possible. That one individual, even in the midst of a dark, dark time, can actually have all kinds of tremendous impact within the church and church planning and spreading the gospel, or within the spheres or the domains that God has them to go to. And we looked at Radi and his life and how he could have just given up. He could be the most pessimistic person in the world because of what he saw in his own country in Cambodia, and living in the jungles and eating tree bark. Even when they got peace and prosperity, it would have been very easy for Radi to think, well, you just have to look out for yourself in this world. In fact, after peace returned to Cambodia, Radi was in Phnom Penh, where he was being educated, and he had really a great promise for a young Khmer man. He had all kinds of jobs lined up, and I would have understood it if he'd said, you know what, this is just the world we live in. I can't change it. The best I can do is try to provide for myself and my family. But he didn't do that. After he became a Christian, he gave up all that promise of a career. And that is way different from me saying I gave up promise of career. We're talking about in Cambodia at that time, in the early 1990s. He gave that all up because he believed that he could be a part of not just providing for himself, but transforming his nation. And we're literally seeing that every time I go back. I go back to Cambodia every year. Every time I go back, you see more and more change. Not just physical change with the buildings, but you see more churches. You see people's lives transformed. You see hope in the younger generation where there used to be no hope. And so the connection is hopefully pretty clear as you go into the book of Ruth. Ruth is right after the book of Judges. And let's open up to chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. Would someone just read that out for us? Ruth is one of those books where if you're having your reading in the afternoon, you're like, yes, 4 chapters. I can actually accomplish something and feel good about it. Yep.
In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem and Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him.
And so all we need really is that first verse, and it tells us a world of information. Especially after you guys have been studying Judges, you know what that first phrase means. That all he has to do is say, in those days when the judges ruled. Now you know, what did that look like? Well, it looked like the Danites committing genocide against a small people group up north because they refused to try to take the land that God had given them. It means Levites having concubines and cutting them up. It means guys like Samson visiting prostitutes and, just out for himself and petty vengeance. Everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. For people from American history, it'd be like saying back in the days of the Wild West. That's all I have to do is kind of say that opening line to place our story within a context of lawlessness, of gunslingers, of boom towns, and all those kinds of things if you're an American. Well, for the Jews, that's all we needed to hear. In the days when the judges ruled. That should tell us that this story is probably going to be bleak. We don't really expect it to be that happy. We expect there to be suffering and hardship. And that's immediately what we find. It says there was a famine in the land. Why do you think there was a famine in the land of Israel? Judgment. Judgment. Okay, how do we know that? Deuteronomy. Right? Let's get even more Bible nerdish. What chapter in Deuteronomy? 28. Yes, thank you. You get the cookie award. All right, so Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. I've been repeating them for you because understanding those chapters helps you understand the rest of the narratives. Because unfortunately, the Israelites worked their way through progressively almost every single curse and very few of the blessings. And one of the specific curses that God promises is there'll be famine. And again, it was supposed to be a wake-up call. If they knew the law of the Lord, if they knew their scriptures, the famine should have made them immediately think this could be judgment. Not absolutely. Okay? Every time there's physical suffering, it's not because God is punishing his people. But that should have been the first question they asked. Let's get on our knees, just like Joshua did when they lost the battle. Let's get on our knees and ask God, is this happening because of discipline? Because if so, God's trying to help us to change. He's trying to bring us lovingly back as our Father. And look at where they go. It says, there's a famine in the land of Judah, and so where do they go instead? That's sad. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about Moab. Didn't really have the most auspicious of beginnings. The book of Genesis told us about how Moab began, shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. How did Moab begin? Lot and his daughters. I don't know what it is about Genesis stories about parents getting drunk and kids doing really horrible, wrong things to their parents, but that's the way that Genesis tells us the country of Moab, the people of Moab began, an incestuous relationship. And really, unfortunately for that people group, it kind of continues on down that line. They never come to the worship of Yahweh, even though they should have known about it. If they came from Lot, Lot knew who Yahweh was. He was, Abram's nephew. He could have been included in the promise. But he chooses things like, hey, I'll go and live down by Sodom and Gomorrah because it's easier and the land is better. And that decision alone tells you a world about Lot. So his people, the people that descend from him, worship idols. So it's an idol-worshiping nation. God did not give it to the people. Remember, he said, don't take this country. It's not part of your promised land, but they become enemies. We saw that in the book of Judges. It's one of the nations that God used to bring discipline to his people. So they're constantly fighting. It's an idolatrous people, and that's the best place where you can go. Right? Again, just in one verse, not only do we know that it's this time of lawlessness in the Judges, and not only do we know that God is judging them, there's this famine in the land, but now we know how bad it gets when an idolatrous, incestuous nation is the best place you can think of to ride out the famine. I mean, again, it's just one sin on top of another. Instead of just dealing with the problem and saying the problem is sin, let's repent, and then the famine will be lifted, they're like, we're out of here. Let's go find someplace else to ride out the famine, and Moabites have food, and let's go over there. And oh, by the way, while we're there, let's pick up some Moabite women for our sons. Just layer upon layer. Like we said yesterday, you get so far down this cycle of sin, you have no idea which way is up. You have no idea, again, what is wrong with your lifestyle because you've constantly made that choice for yourself. So that's the setting of the book of Ruth. And I like this picture over here to the left. And the picture is just this darkness. You're in this dark pit. And that to me symbolizes Judges. The dark pit of sin, of idolatry, relapsing, of guys like Samson and prostitution and genocide and violence. And yet there's this little light. There's like an open door and a ladder. There's a means to get out of it. And that to me is the book of Ruth. It is a light in the darkness. I mean, praise God that he included this story for a lot of different reasons, but especially after Judges. Right? Because, like I said, we got to be optimistic in the first 2 days of class. Anybody feeling a little bit pessimistic when they finish Judges? In your readings, you know, you're like, oh man, this is depressing. I don't want to keep reading this. Little preview in Samuel and Kings, sometimes things go even worse. But you kind of feel that way, and so you read Ruth and it's just a breath of fresh air. A breath of optimistic air just kind of manages to get into the stale, evil air of Judges. But what really is the story about? Okay, that's an artist rendition of Ruth out there gleaning. Is it just about what we can do as an individual in the midst of an evil generation? Well, I think that's an encouragement, but I'm not sure if your average reader would say that's the main thrust of the book. That's the main idea. So I got some options for us. Take a little vote here in a minute. Is Ruth mainly a love story? Right? That's the way that was taken a lot of times in my youth group growing up. That we would go through the book of Ruth and we would learn dating principles, and there's even a really kind of racy Christian joke that youth pastors are throwing out there based on Boaz's name. And we won't do that this morning because I've done enough PG-13 stuff. But, I mean, that's what it was billed as. That you need to wait. God's got the perfect spouse for you. Just like it appeared for Ruth, there was no hope. And yet Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer, and they have kids and are married, and good things flow. So is it a love story? Okay, is it a story about family? That could be something extremely relevant for Western society, something I've been impressed being in Taiwan and how people take care of their parents. That's a whole nother lecture, whole nother focus. But is that what this book is mainly about? Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. The Boaz part is just how God helps Ruth care for her own family. And the fact that the other two daughter-in-laws, even though we understand it, they go back and Ruth stays. Even puts her life at risk in order to serve her elderly mother-in-law. Not even her own mom, but her mother-in-law. Is that what this book is about? It's supposed to be God's challenge to us about concepts of family. Is it about God's heart for the Gentiles? Right, so we got Ruth, and she's a Moabite. And we're going to read, she shouldn't even be stepping foot, really, into God's people. She shouldn't be stepping foot anywhere near the tent of meeting. And yet somehow she ends up miraculously, like Rahab, another Gentile in the line of David, which means she's in the line of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, remember I said the author singles out Rahab, lists her out instead of trying to hide her, which is a normal Jewish male thing to do. Puts her right in there to say God's redemptive plan is way different than anybody thought. Yes, Jesus is from the line of Judah, he's from the line of kings, but there are Canaanite prostitutes in his line. Well, there's also a Moabite in his line. Someone who wasn't even allowed to go into the tabernacle itself is in the line of the Messiah. Should throw us a curveball. And so is it just, again, throughout the whole Old Testament? We just think that God's heart for the Gentiles was only revealed in the New Testament sometimes. But as you're going through Genesis on, I hope that you've seen there's just multiple occasions where God shows his heart for the Gentiles, whether it was in the book of Exodus, when the people left, and I said a mixed crowd went with them. There were Egyptians who left Egypt because they believed in the Jewish God after all those plagues. I think I'd be a believer after all those plagues, but there were a few who went with them. Maybe it's, again, the story of Rahab in the book of Joshua. Maybe it's the story of Ruth. There's just all these things that, as we said, the people believe in God. They cease to be whatever they were. They're no longer Canaanite. They're no longer Moabite. They are God's people. And that's the same story really for us, right? That's how Paul puts it. We've all been adopted. We've all been adopted into God's family, his spiritual family. Or is Ruth really a story about women? As we looked at Deborah and we were like, yeah, women power, and JL with the tent peg. Like God trying to give a specific message about his plan and the beauty of women. Not just like physical beauty, but we're talking about spiritual, emotional, and what he wants to use women to accomplish out in the world. All right, so you're going to have to pick one. I know the easy answer would be, it's about all of them, right? But what do you think it's mainly about? All right, so if you think Ruth is mainly a love story, raise your hand. Wow. I get one? All right. Is Ruth mainly a story about family? Yeah, we get a few. All right, is Ruth mainly a story about women?
Do we have to choose out of this four?
Yes, you have to choose out of this four. Because I'm teaching and I'm in control. Or is Ruth about God's heart for the Gentiles? Wow. All right. The reason I asked this, it is kind of not a fair question because all of these come across in the book. However, I think what happens is that we bring to the table our background, our situation, where we're at, to say what's the main thing that we get out of the book. We're New Testament people, so Ruth being God's heart for the Gentiles, sometimes that's the way we view the book. Or maybe we're single and we would like to be married, and so Ruth turns into a love story. Or maybe we're a woman, we come from an oppressed background, and so Ruth becomes a story about women's liberation. And so that's just natural. We all do that as we come to the Bible and we read it, we bring our own circumstances. And that is not always wrong. Sometimes it shows the beauty that God's word is what we call multivalent or polyvalent. And what that means is that God can use it to speak in different ways to different people at different times. It doesn't mean that it can mean anything. That's not true. But it just means that God can speak different stuff to people out of the exact same couple of verses even. And it's really truth from God or his revelation. The challenge that we have with saying that Ruth is about mainly any of these or all of these is that sometimes because of our background, for most of us, we miss one of the main things that I believe the book of Ruth is about. And that is, it's a story about God's heart for the poor and oppressed. And I don't think we have to feel bad about this. This is just life. This is just God's sovereignty of how we grew up. I grew up in a Western nation. I grew up, even though I look back, and at the time, I didn't think we had very much because my dad was a farmer. So my dad couldn't buy me the latest Michael Jordans. I actually had to get a job. I mean, when I was 10 years old, I started working. I had a job pretty much forever after that. My first job working for my dad, I made $2.50 an hour. back-breaking work. It's ridiculous. And I remember being so happy when I got hired at a fast food restaurant and I was getting paid $3.15 an hour. Big money to flip a hamburger. In 43 years, I have never had a day of my life that I literally didn't have food. Maybe I chose not to because I was fasting or YWAM base was fasting, but there's never been a day in my life where I didn't have food because I couldn't afford it. Right? Even if it was YWAM food, which I will confess I have complained way more than I ever should have about YWAM food, right? Or because there just wasn't any. Sometimes people are starving because there literally is no food. There's a famine, there's a drought. I don't know if you read some of the articles today. It's so sad about the aid that's going into Nepal. That a lot of the long-term YWAMers and missionaries in there are saying, stop giving aid if you're giving it through main organizations, because Nepal, the government, is starting to seize all funds. All the money that's coming in through those charities, they're saying it has to go to their government first for them to manage it. And the same thing is true about all the aid that's coming into the Kathmandu airport. They're saying all that aid, we have to distribute it. It has to be in our control. And what the fear is that they're just going to graft off most of it. You know? And so those people understand what it's like to be oppressed. They understand what it's like to literally wonder, will I eat today? I've never had that. Not in any of my outreaches. I never had to worry if we were going to eat today. And yet that is the situation of so many people around the world. And I fear that because of our background, because of the blessings actually that God's given most of us to be from prosperous nations, we will never get that point of the Old Testament. And it's throughout. Hold your finger there in Ruth and open up to the book of Deuteronomy. We're talking about the Sphere View Bible. Spheres Domains was actually kind of a new teaching when I first joined YWAM. It's a little scary, dating myself. And one of the things we did when we went through the book of Deuteronomy is we actually color-coded. We picked out, different themes, and we said, okay, what does God have to say about justice? What does God have to say about family, civil crime? And we looked at those themes, and one of the themes that you could choose was, what is God's heart for the poor? And we could do the same thing when we got to the Proverbs. Book of Proverbs, we could say, what does God say about money and poverty? And you really are almost overwhelmed at how much is in there that we kind of skip over, because we know as Christians we're supposed to be helping poor people, and we put money in the Salvation Army Bowl at Christmas, but it's still hard for us to identify. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15, and read verses 7 through 11. Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11.
But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you have arrived in the land your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse someone a loan because the year for canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make the loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor, not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be some in the land who are poor. This is why I am commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need.
This is so different from their culture at that time. So different. In their culture, if you were poor or if you were needy, it's because the gods weren't blessing you. The gods were in control of all life in their mind. And so it's your fate. You're kind of locked into that. And there's nothing I can do about it. And really, because everybody was poor, everybody was suffering, there was very little ability to help people. And so if you did actually get finances, if you got ahead, the last thing you're probably thinking is, let me help everyone else, because there's just too many people to help. And so right into the Pentateuch, right into the God's law, there is just verse after verse after verse about helping poor people, about making sure that they don't become the oppressors that they just escaped from. That's what God reminds me. Like, anytime you're tempted to kind of oppress people, anytime you get successful, do not forget where you came from. You were slaves in Egypt. You were oppressed. You had no Sabbath. And that was the big deal about the Sabbath. We just think of it as our right now to get time off. Slaves don't get time off. Right? We realize that? Slaves don't get a day off. They don't get a weekend. So when God instituted the Sabbath and talked to them about it, that was revolutionary. What? We get a day where we don't work? That's crazy. So God is always trying to remind them of their background. And from their background, Israel should have been the best place to be for the poor and the needy. Israel should have been a light, again, in the darkness of all the nations around them on how they treated the poor. And yet, by the time you get to read books like Micah and Amos and Hosea and Isaiah, God's speaking through his prophets, and the number one sin that he's condemning is idolatry. But guess what the number 2 sin is that he condemns? Social injustice. And it may shock you. When you read through the prophets, yes, of course, idolatry is the sin that's most condemned. But the sin that's talked about the most after that is social injustice. That they're oppressing widows, and they're stealing their houses, and they're oppressing the poor and robbing them in order to live a wealthy, rich lifestyle. Amos and Micah are really 2 of the main Old Testament prophets that have a lot to say about how they misuse their prosperity and abuse the poor. And so kind of keep that in mind as you read on. All right, turn ahead to Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. Now we're going to get the specific laws that give us the background for the book of Ruth. So it's someone read, when you get there, chapter 24, and go ahead and read verses 19 through 22.
When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheep in the field, you should not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you should not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this.
And that's one of the things that separates Boaz out, and it makes him unique in this little town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the name of the city, actually means house of bread. Beth at the first, bite in Hebrew means house, Lahem means bread. So it was a farming area, and it still is today in Israel. So Boaz is this kind of wealthy landowner, and he's got all these migrant workers and people working the land, but he's actually obeying the law. He seems to know the law. And again, this is in the days the judges ruled. So it's not just Ruth that will end up standing out in this particular story, but it really is Boaz. I mean, Ruth is a Moabite. We wouldn't actually even expect her to know morality or ethics or loyalty or any of those things. But Boaz is this guy from the city of Bethlehem. He is a Jew, and he should know it, but that doesn't mean anything, as we looked at Jephthah and Samson and Gideon, but he actually does. And he leaves the gleanings, and there's kind of a whole group of poor people working the gleanings on his land. And he gives instructions to his workers for them not to be molested. Like, wow, so different from what happened to the concubine at the end of the story, where, you know, she's raped and the guy comes out, the Levite comes out, and he doesn't even seem to care. Right? She like crawls to the doorway, dies with her hand on the threshold. He opens the door, she kind of falls in the morning, and he says, "Let's go, get up." Let's go, get up. Not, "Oh my goodness, how are you? Are you okay? I'll take you to medical." Just get up, we're leaving. And that's when he realizes that she's dead. And yet Boaz is instructing his men, don't molest these women. Leave these women alone. Allow these women to glean, and actually let them get a little extra. And so it is possible, not just for Ruth to be a light in the darkness, but Boaz shows us it's possible. Even if everyone is cheating on your taxes, right? We just had IRS deadlines. Even if everyone's cheating on your taxes, you should be a light in the darkness. Even if everyone is watching this show or talking about this or gossiping, you could be a light in the darkness. Even if no one else is caring for the poor, no one else gives of their money, no one else gives of their time, you can still be a light in the darkness like Boaz. And I just encourage us that wherever God has us, we need to be considering what are we doing for the poor and the needy and the oppressed. And it's tempting for us here in Kona, in a YWAM base, not to think about it much because we're transient. We're always like, we're 3 months in and then we're out. And then we're 6 months in and then we're out. And again, the mentality is we're going out so that we can minister to poor people in Africa and Asia, Central South America. But there's still poor people in Kona. There are poor people in Kona, and there's a lot of local churches that have amazing programs that you can plug into. When I was leading the SBS, and I had this pesky guy named Yo who was on my staff, and another guy named John. And both John and Yo were those annoying staff who just wouldn't leave you alone until you did what they were asking you to do. And the thing that they would not drop is, what are we doing in the community? What are we doing to really help and get plugged into the community? And so John was the first one. He helped us do a joint project with the School of Worship, and we would go down once a week on Wednesday night. There was a church that's right on Ali'i Drive then that was kind of renting out one of the old steakhouses that was an open kind of place. And so we went to the kitchen, and the kitchen said, we'll let you come in and make chili every Wednesday night. Man, we made a lot of chili. Probably really tasted horrible, but we made a lot of chili. And so we'd go, we'd make the big things of chili, and then we'd roll up the vans, and everybody would start complaining, we're in SBS, we got a lot of work to do, we got charts, we can't go down into town, right? And John and Yo were completely unsympathetic, right? This is biblical, this is a mandate, this is what we should be doing. And so we'd load into the vans, we went down there, we did it together with the School of Worship, and we would serve the chili, and then sometimes people would give testimonies, sometimes people would just play music, and then we would sit, at all the tables when the homeless people would start coming in and just talk to them and love on them. Well, this kind of went for a while, and then that church moved. We didn't have that location anymore, and so Yo wasn't giving up though, because we had so many students that next quarter. It's like over 400 students. And so they really didn't need us for work duties. We kind of all knew that, but we all do work duties because it builds character. And that's why we do work duties. And and so Yo came up to me and he said, why don't we ask and see if our SBS work duties can be community service? And it's like one of those hardened, grizzled, pessimistic old-timers like me. I'm like, yeah, right. There is no way that they will ever give you permission to let all of our students go and do that, because then everybody will want to do that. Or, and the other problem is because we're 9-month students, they always wanted us for certain jobs, so they wouldn't have to retrain us every quarter. And so they're never going to just want to release us. And so Yo just went because he's a pioneer, he's apostolic, he just goes, and he comes back, he's like, yep, we're done. They are going to let us pretty much use all of our students, and we just have to find and set up the community outreach. And so that's what we did. We found, we worked with the Salvation Army. We had a group that was working with troubled teens after school. A group that was working with Solid Rock Church on a feeding down in Triangle Park. We had another group that was, I can't remember all of them, but it was like 5 or 6 different, I know what the other one was. We had a group of guys, some of them had been DTS staff, who said, we just want to go downtown and put up a table and put cookies out and put up a little sign that says free prayer. I'm like, that is so lame. There's no way that you're gonna, and in this sign, it was so sad. It really was just a cardboard box, and poor handwriting wrote free prayer on it. And those guys would go down there, and you know how many people they witnessed to and brought to Christ and prayed over, and how many people, because they almost couldn't pass that up. I have to ask, what are you guys doing? What do you mean free prayer? And they did that, again, for 9 months, and really reached into the community and built relationships. And so from that point on, that was kind of God's mandate to me. No matter where you go and you lead schools, you have got to keep doing this. I sent you Yo and a guy named John to kind of kick you in the rear end, to quit thinking about it's just when we leave here. And so when we went to Montana, we were leading the school there. It was more difficult to get plugged into local ministry because that area of Montana, there's not very many homeless because it's cold, right? You know, you tend, if you're homeless, you got to move somewhere warmer because you're going to be outside a lot. And yet still, we found a Salvation Army that we could plug in with, and then we helped them sort clothes, we helped them repaint, we went to their weekly feeding. You know, we just kept working at it till we found ministry. And one of my staff was always, that was their job. They were community outreach. And we didn't get it as a work duty. Montana was a smaller base. They needed us to do stuff to keep the base running. So we did it on top of everything else. And the students just, when they got there, that was just the way it was. And I believe that when they saw the ministry, and it actually brought refreshment to them, it came back and they were reading Leviticus and reading Deuteronomy and reading about these laws about taking care of poor people, and then they were out there doing it. And I actually think it gave them more motivation to keep studying God's Word. So all that to say that we need to look at Ruth and make sure that we don't miss this message in the book. That a big piece of this book is about God's heart for the oppressed and the poor. All right, let's talk about the key information. So I'll give you a little bit of help for your homework. I had a slide like this for Judges, and it kind of disappeared somehow, so I'll try to put that back into the PowerPoint when you guys can distribute it. So I believe that the main idea, again, God is the hero. Ruth gets her name in the sentence, but God really is the hero again. God is the one who rewards Ruth's loyalty and faithfulness. Loyalty and faithfulness with blessings. And of course, that ultimate blessing is not just that she gets food, and not just because that would be good enough. I mean, for someone who's starving, not just that she finds a home, which is also huge for someone who's displaced, that she gets a kind and loving and rich, that's kind of nice, husband, right? That would be a blessing, but then she gets children. And those children will go on to be one of the most influential people in Israel's history, and then one of the most influential people in world history. Not bad. It's pretty good blessings God gave her. And that's the encouragement then to us on the reason written and to the original audience, is to show what one righteous individual can do in the midst of suffering and evil. And I do believe that, yes, looking at God's redemptive theme that you guys are tracing, a big part of Ruth is about God's heart for the Gentiles. It is about his heart for Moabites and to include them into his kingdom plan. And the genealogy in chapter 4 is kind of looking forward to that, God's redemptive plan through the Davidic dynasty. All right, any questions up to this point? All right, as far as dating goes, can we narrow it down anymore? That's great that we say it's in the time period of the Judges, but that basically is 375 all the way down to 1100 BC. And so some biblical scholars feel like you can dig out some details, maybe try to place this a little closer. Some say, okay, if you look at the relationship with Moab, maybe this is sometime during the time period of Gideon, right? Because it can't be at a time when Moab is oppressing Israel, because why would you go to your oppressor, is kind of the thought. But really the bottom line is we can't say for certain. So when you put when the book was written, you pretty much just have to say it's somewhere in this phase. Now, again, it would be great if you could turn to chapter 4 and say, oh, there is a way to kind of get the dating if you look at the genealogy. Because it goes from chapter 4, if you look at chapter 4, starting in verse 18, it says, now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. So that brings us up to the time of the story. And then you can count the generations after him, and we have a date for David. So Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And we know that David ruled around 1000 BC. So they say if you count from David, and you go up those generations, then maybe that would place it kind of somewhere smack dab in the middle of this time period of the Judges. However, genealogies, the way they work in Old Testament times, is they're not always complete. They're not always like every single person is listed in the genealogy. And when you get to Matthew chapter 1, there's people that are left out of that genealogy, the genealogy of Jesus. It's not meant to be deceiving. You just put the main people. A lot of times you'll put like the leading figure of that time period. And so you might skip a son, a grandson, because they're just not important to the telling of the story. So, all right, we'll just leave it there. It really doesn't drastically affect your understanding of the book. Now, there is one thing I want to address, because I think the story pretty much really, it's a beautiful story, but for the sake of time, we can't go through it in detail. And I think it's self-explanatory, most of it. People don't have a lot of questions about it. However, in chapter 3, there's kind of a big debate that goes on. What exactly did Ruth do at the threshing floor? Okay, what exactly did Ruth do at the threshing floor? Okay, so we kind of know the story up to that point. God leads them miraculously to Boaz's field, and Ruth is out there gleaning at the exact time that Boaz comes to inspect this one field out of his many holdings. See the sovereignty of God in the whole story. And he hears, it's not because he says, oh, she's beautiful, that's why I want to protect her and give her extra. He says specifically, because I heard how you treated your mother-in-law. Everybody in Bethlehem actually knows about this Moabite who sacrificed, who left her family, who left her nation, and came here in order to serve her mother-in-law, her Jewish mother-in-law, and we're impressed by that. It's kind of like so odd and rare, and that's why he seeks to give her favor. And so then Naomi realizes, hey, he doesn't have a wife, and you don't have a husband anymore. This could really work out. And so Naomi does a mother-in-law, very Jewish mom kind of thing to do, right? Tells her to get dressed up, take a shower, use some deodorant, pretty her hair up, right? Go down to the beauty salon, and go down there at the exact timing. So after they've celebrated the harvest, his stomach is full, he gets a little liquored up, right? He's kind of in a very good frame of mind, and that's when you go and you let him know that he could be a kinsman redeemer and that you are single and available. So it's like the dating game going on here. So she goes down to the threshing floor, and Boaz is drunk, which is another biblical theme, drunk men of the Bible. And and here's what happens. Would someone read chapter 3, verses 7 through 9?
After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly and uncovered his feet and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer."
Now, today, if we just read this, we didn't understand Hebrew, we didn't understand the culture at this time, we think, oh, it's kind of sweet, right? She comes up and his heart is merry, and she wants to get his attention, but she doesn't want to startle him, so she just uncovers his feet a little bit, and the cool air, because he's out on the threshing floor, the cool air comes in, and he kind of just wakes up and sees a vision of loveliness, right? Who are you? And then she says, oh, I'm Ruth, and will you basically claim your right to be kinsman redeemer and do this, spread your cloak out over me? And he ends up being willing to do that. And in chapter 4, they have to kind of step through a little issue because there's a closer relative. He passes up that right, and so then they're together. However, in Hebrew, it's the same as Greek. In most languages, we have what are called euphemisms. And these euphemisms are what make language translation fun, or learning another language. Like when you go, you say, how do I say I need to go to the bathroom? Well, if you literally just look at that, it just means you're literally walking towards an area where you bathe. However, we all know that go to the bathroom is a euphemism for urinate. But we don't say that. Excuse me, I need to urinate. Can you tell me where I can go to urinate? Because I really need to urinate. You're like, dude, whoa, harsh. All right? Little English, little TESOL lesson. We say go to the bathroom. But I don't need to bathe. I don't need to go to a room for bathing. I need to go for urination. Right? And so this is kind of the fun we have in YWAM and in missions. And a lot of times we use these euphemisms. One of the ones that you saw in Judges is this one. What does it mean to know someone? The normal meaning in most of the cases is they literally recognize someone or they actually know them mentally. However, starting with the book of Genesis, and Adam knew his wife and she conceived a son, they're like, whoa, that's some deep knowing, right? It's a euphemism sometimes. It can be used as a euphemism for sexual relations. And there's another euphemism for sexual relations in the Old Testament, and that is...
Oh no.
Yes. The uncovering of the feet. And I don't know what your translation exactly does with this. In the book of Leviticus, when you're looking at the book of Leviticus particularly, it goes through a lot of things that they're not supposed to do. Culture or idolatrous practices of the land. For example, chapter 18. So uncover the feet, or sometimes it'll be uncover, that'll even translate it nakedness. But really in Hebrew, it uses the word for feet. And it just keeps going. Don't uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. Don't uncover the nakedness of your sister. And it's not just about being naked. It's talking about don't have sexual relations with these close relatives. And so when we look at chapter 3 of Ruth, we have to say there's a legitimate chance that that's what this Hebrew phrase is meaning. When she goes and uncovers his feet, it's not just so he'll wake up. But he's drunk, he's kind of passed out, and she almost takes advantage of him. And really, the way that we know a euphemism on which know it is, or whether you're literally just uncovering someone's feet, is the context. It's just like, it's the same way in real life. How do you know what someone means by a certain phrase that can have several different meanings? The context. The person, the situation, all that. And so to me, I think it's ridiculous that some people think that Ruth goes and has sex with him. And that's kind of how she manipulates him into being her husband. I don't see that as consistent. Remember, the whole big picture of this book is how God rewards Ruth's loyalty and faithfulness, and how one individual can really be righteous, like Boaz and like Ruth. And so to me, if I look at the context of the whole story, that tells me that she really did just uncover his feet so that he would wake up. And so you can kind of do with that what you will, but I think that's a case where we start digging into it, and we want to know the background and the language, and that's all important, but we can't forget the bigger message, the bigger literary context of these books. I just don't think that Ruth was doing that. All right, so let's stop and let's try to bring this home a little bit practically before we take our break. Let's think about who Ruth was. And basically that she was a person that all the cards were stacked against her. That she had every disadvantage almost possible. We talked about Genesis 19, how she was a Moabite, and the Moabites were the product of the incest between Lot and his daughter. So of course, how do Israelites look at Moabites? They would look down on them anyway. I mean, come on, if that's the common agreed upon story, not for Moabites. Moabites didn't say that's how their people group started, but the Israelites believed that. This is what the Israelites would say. So you're not going to really respect, you're always going to look down on them because they came from this incestuous relationship. Because of that enmity between them, because of the idolatry and the fighting back and forth, God actually says in chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, no Moabite to the 10th generation That's a long time. That's a long time. If you say a generation is 40 years, it's up to 400 years. If you are descended from a Moabite, you cannot come into the sanctuary. They are never to promote their welfare. And so that's weird. You think, well, again, it seems like there's a whole lot of welfare promotion going on in this particular story. But as I said, who is a Moabite and who is an Israelite? We need to shift our minds in that it's not primarily to God about ethnicity or about bloodlines. It's a spiritual condition. And if you understand that in the Old Testament, it'll make Romans 9 through 11 a little bit easier to understand as well. And so she's got this going against her. But I mean, it's just like the hits keep coming. First of all, she's a woman, and we've discussed what women's lives were like at this particular time period. They were seen as possessions. They were seen as only having value to bear children and take care of them. They had very little legal status at all in most of these societies. They couldn't form covenants. Again, this is a patriarchal society in which it was just commonplace to see women treated as property and objects and have horrible things done to them sexually. And so she's got that going against her. Strike number 2, she's a widow. So she's gone through this suffering. And remember, as I said, there's nothing that happens by chance. So if her husband is dead, and her father-in-law is dead, and her other brother-in-law is dead, she's like cursed. That's the way people would look at it. Like, God didn't protect your husband, you're a widow because the gods are angry with you. But as a widow, there was little hope. Well, how could she provide for herself? How could she earn a living? It's not like she could go down and really get a normal job because she's a woman. She can't hold property. She can't hold any kind of a business. What is she supposed to do? That's why when Abraham kicks Hagar out, remember Sarah gets jealous. She says, kick the slave woman out with the child, with Ishmael. They just go out in the wilderness to die. They just think there's no hope for us. I'm not just a widow, but I don't have a man to protect me. And God meets Hagar and protects her. And that's the only way she survives. And so you're a widow, there's really no hope. And that even goes to the New Testament. The New Testament, the church, one of the things that it did was provide for widows, because there was no other provision for them if their families abandoned them. She's displaced. I mean, you could call her a refugee. So there's this famine, there's this hardship, and so she leaves her home. And she and Naomi, she's just following Naomi and hoping that it works out, that they'll find food somewhere. So she's a displaced person. And if you've done any work with refugees or displaced people, you understand how much suffering is involved and how hard and difficult it is for them to really get out of that place. And of course, she's a foreigner. So now as she goes into Israel, she's a foreigner. And almost all Western countries now, there are issues of people that are really upset and angry about foreigners coming into their country, taking their jobs and filling up their jails and so on and so forth across Europe, the United States. There's all this issue about foreigners. I mean, and how they should be treated, or if they should even be allowed to come in. And so that's another kind of strike against her. So really, when you think about it, she should have had no hope. She's a female Moabite displaced widow. And I don't think that it was really that mean that Naomi said, look, don't follow me. If there's any chance for you to survive, it's going to be with your own people. I mean, I just think she was just being realistic. She wasn't just, and when you look at Naomi, and sometimes when we look at her from a Western view, we're like, man, she is bitter. She's just negative, negative, negative. Well, of course she is. How would you be if your husband died, you've lived through famine, your son-in-laws, your sons are dead, I mean, you have nothing left to your name? I understand why she's hopeless, why she's bitter about life, and where is God in the midst of that? But Ruth's got all these things against her. How does she stay positive? How does she stay others-focused? Like in chapter 1, the other two go back, and she says, where you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God, because I'm loyal to you. How is she able to do that? That's the challenge to all of us. And yet, I want to give us some real life examples, to me, real life Ruths. After the war in Afghanistan and the Taliban was taken out, journalists began to go into the country in the early 1990s, and basically what they found was what were women treated like in Afghanistan. Pictures started to come out of, again, the suffering and the abuse that they'd had under the Islamic extremist government. And so these are just a few pictures of, again, the hardships they were put under. And again, the same thing of why they needed to beg, because if for whatever reason they were cast away by their husbands, there was nothing that they could do. They were not educated. People were trying to educate their children in secret, especially if they were girls, because girls aren't educated. Why would you educate a girl? And so the Taliban did not allow that either. And the hospital conditions were just wretched. Most women died in childbirth. And the hospitals were gross, but the men were the ones who were receiving any medical treatment or any of the medicines that they had. The statistics were just really scary. Armed groups had killed, beaten, and raped thousands of women since 1992 when the Taliban took over. Women were not allowed to meet together, work, or express their views in public. Educated women were threatened, they were beaten unless they remained silent. And the Taliban passed laws that women must completely cover their body and discourage them from even going out in public. And so when the Taliban government fell, right, there at least was an open door for ministry. There was an open door for ministry, but how many people really wanted to try to go into that culture and try to bring change or try to help that culture out? Well, you would think that the last person who'd probably want to go there is a woman. Why would a woman want to go to this country? Right? Why would she want to go there unless she's convinced, like Ruth was, that God is faithful, that God is able to provide, that God will reward people who sacrifice and go to some of these horrible places because they care about the people. Maybe you know this person, because here's one of the people that went. This is KJ. This is Brian's wife before she was Brian's wife. She was one of the people from YWAM Kona, and she was actually working with Colorado at that time, who said, "I'll go. I will go." She and another woman named Lori went to Afghanistan in very early days after the Taliban. They lived out in a remote area in a village, and they worked with women. And they taught the women, and they worked with them in the area of community development and to try to rebuild and restore their lives. But in order to do that, she had to lead a pretty difficult lifestyle. It wasn't just bad food or extremely hot conditions. She had to be fully covered. She had to really follow a lot of the cultures. The Taliban's broken, but it's still a very strict Muslim culture. And so she had to wear the full dress. She had to stay indoors a lot of times, especially because they didn't want to draw attention. But she was willing to go, and she saw transformation. She saw women start to realize that they had value in God's eyes, that there was a God who actually cared. And see, that's the thing that women have the hardest time, or the oppressed have the hardest time believing in their situation, is that anybody cares. Does anybody know we're suffering? Does anybody even care? Remember in 2001 when I went to Thailand, and I went to the refugee camps between Thailand and Myanmar, and there were a lot of the people in the camp were Karen. It was a minority people group, mostly Christian, who had been chased out of Burma and persecuted and killed and slaughtered. And talking with this 21-year-old man who had lived in the refugee camp since he was 11, I think that was his question. Do people even know we're suffering? Does anybody even know what's happening in Myanmar? Does anybody even care? Because I've been here for 11 years, and there was no change. Thailand would not let them become full citizens, and then they couldn't go back to Burma because of the persecution. So he was living his life. His whole life growing up was in a refugee camp. And he really, again, that's the question. How should he, or why should he have hope? Women in Hindu culture, it's not much better. In Hindu culture, there are also all kinds of poverty and oppression. And even the Hindu mythology of where women come from, they come from the foot of a god. And in Asian culture, the foot is the most dishonorable, dirty place. So even their myth tells you what they think of women in their society.